Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Hope everyone's doing well. Inshallah, everyone's good. Let's just get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit or soul. He has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And as always, I ask Allah to grant myself and all of you sincere intentions. Ameen. That said, we're going to continue in our book, the 7 Hadeeth, obligatory knowledge that every Muslim must know. In the book, we've reached page 17 at the very bottom, the section entitled Facing the Qibla. So just to remind you where we are discussing the 8 conditions of a valid salat. So we've already mentioned that the person must be Muslim, must have reached an age of mental discrimination, that the person must be in a state of purity, that the person must cover their awrah, that the time of the prayer must have come in. And those are the 5 we've talked about so far. Today, we're going to mention number 6 out of the 8 conditions, which is that the person, in order to have a valid salat, they must be facing the Qibla. It says, number 6, facing the Qibla. The 6th condition of salat is that one face the Qibla. One must face the Qibla with one's chest while standing or sitting, and with the majority of one's body when bowing or prostrating. Okay. So there are a couple things I want to mention here. Number 1 is that when we say the Qibla, what do we mean when we say the Qibla? We're talking about a building. There's a building in the city of Mecca, which is called the Kaaba. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures of it. It looks kind of like a cube. It is covered in a black cloth, so it's kind of black in color. This building, the Kaaba, is the Qibla. That's the Qibla. So in Salat, we're trying to face that building. The goal is to face that building. Now, if you're in a high place, like on a mountaintop, then you don't need to lean forward so that your chest is pointing downwards at the building of the Kaaba. Okay, if you're on one of those mountains near Mecca, you don't have to lean forward. You can stand like normal, and it's okay if your chest is facing the air above the Kaaba. That's okay. Similarly, if you're like a miner and you're down in the mine and it's Salat time, and you turn to face the Kaaba, you don't have to lean back so that your chest is pointing upwards at the building. No, you can stand straight like normal and have your chest face the earth that's beneath the Kaaba. That's also okay. Yeah, that is also okay. But what matters is that when you're in the standing position or the sitting position, it's your chest that determines whether you're facing the Qibla or not. It's not your face. Okay? MashaAllah, I have seen people, I'm sure many of you know, that there's more virtue in the Salat. There's more virtue if you're in the first line of the Salat than if you're in the second line. And there have been times in the course of my studies where it's like all of the students, all of us want to be in the first line. We're like rushing to be in the first line. And I'm telling you, I've seen people squeeze into a little space in the first line, like a little tiny space that's not nearly wide enough for their body to fit in. So their body is like on a slant so that they can get the space. They slant their body. Their chest is not pointing in the direction it needs to point, but they just kind of turn their head. So their face is pointing to the Qibla, but their chest is pointing some other way. If this is what you do, then your Salat is not going to be valid. Your Salat is not going to be valid. Okay, so when you're in the standing position or the sitting position, it's where your chest is pointing that matters. Now, when you're not in the standing or sitting position, then we say it's the majority of your body that has to face the Qibla. So when you're in ruku', for example, the top of your head, the top of your shoulders, your thighs, knees, shins, the front of your toes, all of that is going to be pointing towards the Qibla. So that's the majority of your body. When you're in sujood, you're going to have your back pointing towards the Qibla as well as the top of your head. You're going to have, your thighs, your knees, the tips of your toes, etc. All of that is going to be pointing towards the Qibla. So in those positions, it's the majority of your body that faces the Qibla. Next thing that's important to know is that each Muslim has an obligation. Each Muslim has what? An obligation, which means you don't have a choice about it. Every Muslim has an obligation to determine which direction to face when they make Salat. Okay, we're going to talk about this in a minute. Okay, but don't make a habit of just like walking into a masjid or a musalla and then just automatically praying in whatever direction it's arranged to pray in. Okay, if you didn't take the time to figure out what direction you need to pray in, then you have failed to meet the condition of Salat. So let's talk about what the levels are for making this determination. It says there are 4 levels for determining the Qibla. One's Salat is invalid if he resorts to a lower level when a higher level is feasible. So there's 4 different levels. You must always use the highest level possible. Okay, what's level number 1? Level number 1, it says, having certain knowledge of the Qibla. That is, seeing the Kaaba with one's eyes. So the top level is if it's possible for you to know for certain, like 100% certain, no chance that you're wrong. If it's possible for you to know for certain where the Kaaba is and what direction to face, then you have to go with your knowledge. So if you see the Kaaba, you face the building according to your own sight. You do not have the option of resorting to any of the levels beneath it, which we are going to mention. Right? If you see the Kaaba with your own eyes, you face it. Okay. Now, this may sound funny, but I met a man who told me when he was in Mecca that he was there in the Holy Mosque, right there at the Kaaba. And he told me a man came up to him and asked him, which way is the Qibla in this mosque? Okay, there are Muslims in the world who do not understand what the word Qibla means. They don't know that the Qibla is that building. That's what you're trying to face. Okay, and it's right there when you're in that building, everybody can see it unless you're blind. But he didn't understand that that's what you face. This is a person who has gone his whole life just facing whichever way he's told to face. This is a person who never understood that he needs to figure out himself which way to face. Okay, and level number 1 is saying that if you see it with your eyes, then there's no figuring that needs to happen. You go with what you see. You face that way. Level number 2. So if you're not able to see the Kaaba with your own eyes, then check to see if you're able to do the second level. The second level is being informed by a trustworthy person with certain knowledge. That is, a trustworthy person sees the Kaaba, but you don't. Okay? So, for example, if you are down in a valley and there's mountains between you and the Kaaba, so you can't see the Kaaba because the mountains are blocking your view. But there's a trustworthy person up at the top of the mountain and he can see the Kaaba. Well, as long as that person is trustworthy and as long as he sees it with his eyes, then you can follow level number 2. which is that the person there has certain knowledge because he sees it with his eyes, and he's trustworthy, so you can pray in the direction that he indicates. Why is it okay to pray in the direction that he indicates? Because he has certain knowledge. There's no chance that he's wrong. He sees the Kaaba with his eyes. Okay, there's no chance that he's wrong. And on top of that, he's trustworthy. Okay, so it's more likely that he's being truthful to you than it is that he is not being truthful with you. This is why you can accept what he says and you can pray that way. Note that if you're in this situation where a trustworthy person can see the Kaaba with his own eyes, even though you can't, you cannot resort to level number 3. You must always use the highest level that's possible for you. Level number 3. Level number 3 is performing your personal ijtihad based on evidence. That is, you use the sun, moon, stars, etc. to determine the direction. Level number 3 is ijtihad. What is ijtihad? I'm not going to go into a proper definition now, but in general, the general meaning of ijtihad is that this is when a qualified person is uncertain of an answer, and so he gathers the dalils, and he uses those dalils to try to reach a conclusion, while knowing that his conclusion might not be right. This is called ijtihad. Okay? Note that in level 1, there was no chance the person was wrong because he sees the Kaaba with his own eyes. In level 2, there's virtually no chance of him being wrong because someone who sees the Kaaba with his own eyes is telling you which way to face. So the only risk of error here is if the person chooses not to be truthful. And that's why you can only take the saying of a trustworthy person. But level 3, this is the level that we are on, here in Baltimore where I live. I don't know where all of you live, but most likely you're living in a place where you cannot see the Kaaba with your own eyes. And there's no one that you're in contact with, no one there in the place with you who sees the Kaaba with his own eyes. So levels 1 and 2 are usually going to be not possible, usually. Level 3 is where most of us operate. Level 3 means you make your own personal ijtihad. It means you use the sun, you use the moon, you use the stars, you use the mountains, you use the wind, you use whatever dalils are at your disposal for you to figure out which way to face. Okay, I'm not going to go into more detail about this. This is something that, I recommend that you either speak with your own sheikhs about, or that maybe we have a session, like a special session just to talk about how to do ijtihad. But long story short, if you are qualified, meaning if you know how to use these dalils to determine the qibla, then you must do so. Furthermore, if you have the intelligence, if you have the ability to learn how to use these dalils, these evidences, to figure out the direction of the Kaaba, then you have an obligation to learn it. Okay, you cannot just say, oh, well, I'm smart enough to learn it, but I choose not to learn it. No, these things are obligatory knowledge. Okay, if you're able to learn it, you must go learn it. MashaAllah. I will mention, though, that a compass is a valid tool to assist you in this process, but only if the compass has been trained. Only if the compass has been trained. What do I mean when I say the compass has been trained? I mean that you've gone through a process of determining the direction of north using the North Star and comparing that to where your compass is pointing. Many of you are aware that a compass doesn't actually point north. A compass points to magnetic north. And magnetic north is not the same as true north. Okay. So when we say you train your compass, what we mean is you're measuring how far off the compass is in your location. So you would go, if you're in your city, you would find a North Star. You would determine the direction of north based on the North Star. You'd see how far off your personal compass is. And then from that point on, as long as you stay in the same general geographic area, you can use that compass because you know how far off it is. That's what we mean when we say the compass has been trained. You've measured the discrepancy between magnetic north and true north. And this discrepancy varies from place to place. So just because you measured it when you were in New York, that doesn't mean it's going to be the same in Chicago. Okay? But this is level 3. Level 3 is where you use the signs, the evidences at your disposal to determine which way to pray. Now, if you're not able to do that, if you're not able to use the signs, either because you lack the tools to do it, like say you're blind, for example, if you're blind and so you can't see where the sun is and the stars are, etc., then you're simply not able to make ijtihad. Or if you have a weak mind and you're not capable of learning how to use the evidences, then you can resort to level number 4. It's also possible for a new Muslim to temporarily resort to level number 4 while he's learning how to use the dalils. But level number 4, it says, following a trustworthy and knowledgeable person's ijtihad. Okay, so this is the 4th and final level. If you cannot see the Kaaba with your own eyes, nor is there someone there who does see the Kaaba with their own eyes who can indicate to you the direction, nor are you able to make your own ijtihad on your own, then you resort to this last option, which is you follow whatever direction a trustworthy and knowledgeable person told you based on his ijtihad. Okay, this is done. It says that is, you are unable to perform ijtihad yourself. So if there's someone in your group, for example, who's trustworthy and knowledgeable, and they made ijtihad, and you're not able to make ijtihad, then you can pray in the direction he says to pray in. That's fine. Only because you're not able to make ijtihad. If you are able to make ijtihad, then you cannot follow what that person says. You have to follow what you believe is right in your heart based on your own efforts at determining the direction based on your evidence. And I can tell you that at times this leads to difficulties. There have been times when I made ijtihad to pray a certain direction, and then someone else came up. He wanted to pray with me, but he thought the Kaaba was 2 degrees further to the right than the way I was facing, like something that you can't even perceive with your eyes, like some very super tiny difference. And so he says, no, I can't pray with him because our ijtihads are different. And yes, that's true. We're going to come, when we get to the section on praying in Jama'ah, it is true that if you believe that the person is not facing the Qibla, then you cannot pray behind that person. And when people first start making ijtihad, these types of things can become a problem. This is why I added a paragraph here. What does it say? It says, according to the strongest saying, one makes ijtihad in an attempt to face the Kaaba itself. However, there is another opinion that one makes ijtihad in order to face the direction of the Kaaba instead. So I'm going to share my screen here. Just to show you what I mean. Okay. So here is a circle. We'll put an N over here. Make it a little bit bigger so people can see it. Put an E over here. S down here. W over here. Now, let's say that you are in a part of the world where the Kaaba is southwest. Okay, not talking about the United States. Don't anybody face southwest here in the United States. Kaaba's not that direction from here. Let's say you're in a part of the world where the direction of the Kaaba is southwest. Actually, I'm going to scoot it up a little bit, like this, southwest. Now, if you're following the strongest opinion, then what you're doing is you're making ijtihad to try to face exactly the building of the Kaaba. But I probably don't need to remind you that the further you are away from the Kaaba, the harder it is to face exactly the building. Okay? Because, I mean, you guys understand angles. If I have an angle like this, even if it's a very small angle, this is a very acute angle here that I drew here. There's not much space between the two lines. But if these lines extend further and further out, the space between them will grow. And when you're talking about the whole earth, if you're like thousands of miles away from the Kaaba, then a very small angle, even a 1 or 2 degree difference, ends up being hundreds of miles apart. Like if you face one way and then face the tiniest hair another way, thousands of miles away, it's like you're facing a whole different country. Okay, so the strongest opinion is that you try to face the actual building of the Kaaba, which means that the smallest hair of a difference in direction between one person's ijtihad and another person's ijtihad will cause a person to not be able to pray behind someone. This is why I usually advise people to follow the weaker opinion. Yes, it's a little bit weaker, but for practical purposes, for practical reasons, I advise it. And what is this weaker opinion? This weaker opinion is that you don't need to face the building of the Kaaba. You need to face the direction of the Kaaba. What does that mean, the direction of the Kaaba? It means you split. It means you sort of divide the world from wherever you're standing into segments. If you divide the world into like something like quadrants. Okay, so here you see in this example how I split, the directions into 4 quadrants. But 4 is not enough. You split into 8. So you're gonna divide into 8 segments. So by this weaker saying, as long as you're facing anywhere in the pie slice where the Kaaba is located, then you're facing the correct direction. Because by the second saying, you don't have to be facing exactly the Kaaba, you just have to be facing the direction of the Kaaba. And the direction of the Kaaba is anywhere in this whole entire pie slice. And what this will do, if you take this second opinion, is it will do away with the hardships that come with, minor differences. Like if someone's, 2 or 3 degrees off from where you think to face, now you can both pray together because you're both in the same pie slice. You're both in the same 1/8 direction. And so therefore, you're both agreeing about which direction to face. Even if you disagree about exactly where the Kaaba is, you agree about what general direction. So I definitely advise people to take the easier opinion, even though it is not the strongest opinion. It is something that works, and for practical reasons, I think you should do it. I'm going to stop for a minute and take questions before I move on. Wa alaikum assalam, by the way. I see a lot of salams in the chats. So I'm going to respond to all of them at once. Okay. Well, if there are no questions, I will move on to number 7 of the 8 conditions of Salat. There are 2 more to talk about. Number 7, it says, knowing the obligatory Salat is obligatory. Okay. And this relates to the intention. This relates to the intention. Okay, whenever you're doing something which is in fulfillment of one of the obligations that Allah has made obligatory upon you, it needs to be part of your intention that you're fulfilling an obligation. So if you're praying any of the 5 obligatory salats, you must know in your heart that that salat is an obligation. Otherwise, it will not be your intention that you're fulfilling an obligation by doing it. Okay, so you must know that the obligatory salat is an obligation. Similarly, number 8, it says not believing any of the integrals are a sunnah. Number 8 is very similar to number 7. Just like how you have to know that the salat itself is an obligation in order for that salat to be valid, it is also the case that the elements of the salat which are obligatory, you must also believe that they are obligatory. Okay, and that's the very next section that we're talking about. We're going to talk about the integrals of the salat. What do we mean when we say integrals? We mean the integrals of the salat are the parts of the salat which the validity of the salat depend upon. Okay, the salat has 17 integrals. If you leave out any one of these integrals, then the salat is not valid. If you leave out any one of the integrals, then the salat is not valid. These are called integrals. And all 17 of these integrals, you must believe that they are obligatory. And if you don't believe that they're obligatory, your salat is not valid. Now, there are also other aspects of the salat besides these 17. Those things are not integrals. Those things are actually optional. Like if you were to leave out those other things, your salat would still be valid. Okay, what's an example? What's an example of an integral, since we're talking about it? Reciting Surah Al-Fatiha is an integral. Okay, if you don't recite Surah Al-Fatiha in every rak'ah, then your salat is not valid because it's an integral. However, saying Subhana Rabbi al-Azim when you're in ruku' is not an integral. So if you left that out entirely, then it would not invalidate the salat. We're saying Sami Allahu liman hamida when you come out of ruku', that's not an integral. Okay, if you left it out of the salat, it would not invalidate your salat. Some components of the salat, some aspects of the salat are integrals. And what we're saying with condition number 8 is that the ones that are integrals, you must believe that they are obligations. You must believe that they are obligatory, or else the salat will not be valid. Now, what if somebody doesn't know all these details? What if there's somebody, he doesn't know that some parts of the salat are obligations and some parts are optional? He doesn't know that stuff. He thinks that just all of it is an obligation. Okay, he thinks that the way you pray Salat al-Asr, for example, is to do such and such a whole procedure, beginning with the takbir, ending with the taslim. He memorized the whole procedure of everything to do, and he knows the salat is obligatory, and so he thinks everything in that procedure is obligatory. What about that person? Well, I say there's nothing wrong with that person. Okay, that person, it doesn't matter that he thought some of the optional things were obligations. That's not the issue. As long as he believed the integrals were obligations, then the condition has been fulfilled. Who's the person who doesn't fulfill this condition? It's the person who thinks certain aspects of the salat are optional when they're not. Like the person who thinks you don't have to do sujood twice in each rak'ah. He thinks, the first one is an obligation and the second one is optional. Okay, that person is not performing a valid salat. Is it clear? Inshallah, that's clear. Well, I've only been on for 30 minutes. Let's keep going. I was going to stop there. Let's keep going into the next section, inshallah. The integrals of Salat. MashaAllah, we've made it to the part where we're going to really be talking about how to do Salat, alhamdulillah. So, once all of the conditions of the Salat have been met, and not before then, but once all the conditions have been met, then it's permissible for the person to enter into Salat. Now, when you enter into the Salat, in order for that Salat to be valid, you must perform the 17 integrals that we're going to talk about. Some of these integrals repeat. They need to be done in every rak'ah. Some of the integrals don't repeat. You only do them once. Okay, so you got to pay attention as we go through them to see which ones repeat and which ones do not repeat. All right, let's get to it. It says there are 17 integrals of Salat. And by now you understand that failure to do any one of these 17 will result in an invalid Salat. Number one, the first integral, is to have a valid intention. It says to have the intention in the heart while saying the opening Allahu Akbar. So first thing you need to know is the time of the intention. When a person starts the Salat, they're going to say Allahu Akbar. They're going to say what? Allahu Akbar. And while saying, like while you're in the process of saying Allahu Akbar, you must make sure that the intention, a valid intention, is in your heart while saying that. That's timing. The next thing you need to know about the intention is what exactly are you intending? There's three things that you need to intend. Let's talk through it. It says to have the intention in the heart while saying the opening Allahu Akbar of performing Salat. So there's three things you need to intend. The first of those three things is the act of Salat. Okay, it needs to be in your intention that the reason why you're saying Allahu Akbar is to begin a Salat. Okay, there are lots of reasons why a person might say Allahu Akbar. There are people, they got the prayer beads and they just say Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. They say it many times. Okay, that's called dhikr. There are people who say it as an exclamation. If your kid comes home and says, Daddy, I got an A on my math test, and the father says, Allahu Akbar, like he might be, there's plenty of reasons why a person might say Allahu Akbar, okay? Your intention, the role of an intention, the purpose of an intention is to distinguish between acts of worship and that which is not an act of worship. It also distinguishes between different types of acts of worship. Okay? So, like you need to intend the act of Salat. You need to intend that you're saying Allahu Akbar in order to begin a Salat. What's the second thing that you need to intend? It says, and specifying its cause or time if it has one. So some Salats have a time, such as the 5 obligatory Salats. They all have times. So if the Salat you're praying is a Salat that has a time, then in your intention, you have to specify the time of the Salat. Like Dhuhr, for example. The Dhuhr Salat has a time. So if I want to pray the Dhuhr Salat, I need to, in my intention, I need to intend the act of Salat as well as the time of Dhuhr. Why am I designating in my intention the time of Dhuhr? Because the Salat that I'm praying is the one that comes during Dhuhr time. That's the one I'm praying. Also, there are some salats that don't have a time, but they have a cause. There are some salats that do not have a time, but they have a cause. Okay, what's an example of a salat with a cause? It's, it just so happens that tonight we are expected to have a lunar eclipse tonight. It's expected to be visible all throughout the United States. Here on the East Coast, they say it'll be visible between like 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. But yeah, there's going to be a full moon that's going to slowly disappear. It's not going to disappear entirely, but they say like 90% of it is going to disappear. It's a lunar eclipse. And there is a salat called an eclipse salat. And I'm not going to talk to you now about how to do it, but there is such a thing as an eclipse salat. And so if you wanted to pray the eclipse salat, know that the eclipse salat doesn't have a time, it has a cause. Okay, you do that salat because of something that's occurring. And in this case, it would be the eclipse. Another example of a salat that has a cause is the 2 rakahs you pray to greet the masjid. If you walk into a masjid, it's recommended to pray 2 rakahs before you sit down. Those 2 rakahs, why are you praying those 2 rakahs? Is it because there's a special time for them? No, it's because there's a cause for them. Okay, you pray those 2 rakahs because you entered into the mosque. So if your salat has a time, then in your intention, you need to specify its time. If your salat has a cause, then in your intention, you specify its cause. If you're praying a salat that has neither a time nor a cause, then you don't need to specify any of those. Okay? You don't need to specify either of those things in your intention if the particular salat you're doing doesn't have a time or a cause. So what are the things you need to intend? Number 1, the act of salat. Number 2, the time or the cause, if it has one. It says, and intending its obligation if obligatory. The third thing that you need to intend is that you are fulfilling an obligation. Okay, so if the salat you're praying is an obligation, then it must be in your intention that you're fulfilling the obligation. So if a person wanted to pray Asr, a valid intention would be, I pray obligatory Asr. Okay, I pray obligatory Asr. That's a valid intention, because by saying I pray, he is intending the act of salat. By saying obligatory, he is intending that he's fulfilling an obligation. And by saying Asr in his heart, that means he's intending the obligatory salat that comes during Asr time. That's the one he's praying. So if he intends those 3 things, then his intention is valid. Okay, there are people who also intend other things beyond those 3. Like people intend that they're doing it lillahi ta'ala. They're doing it for the sake of Allah. And that's good to intend. But even if you don't put that in your intention, the intention is still valid. Some people also intend whether they're praying on time or whether it's a makeup prayer, whether they're doing ada or whether they're doing qada. And that's also fine and good even to do in your intention, but your intention is valid without it. As long as you've intended the act of salat, the time or the cause, if it has one, and you've intended obligation, if it's obligatory, then you've done everything that needs to be done. I'll give examples to illustrate. Let's say someone wants to pray Maghrib, which is an obligatory salat. His intention, he will intend all 3 of these things. He'll intend, I pray obligatory Maghrib. Okay? Let's say a person wants to pray Fajr. Okay? But I'm not talking about the 2 rakahs of Fajr which are obligatory. I'm talking about the 2 optional rakahs beforehand. The 2 sunnah rakahs that we pray before the obligatory Fajr. For those 2 rakahs, his intention would be, I pray Fajr. I pray Fajr. Why would that be his intention? Because he's intending the act of salat. And because those 2 sunnah rak'ahs have a time, he needs to intend the time of it. The time for those rak'ahs is Fajr time. Okay, but because those 2 rak'ahs are not obligatory, he does not intend the obligation. So therefore, the 2 rak'ahs he's praying, because of his intention, they will be the 2 sunnah rak'ahs of Fajr time, not the 2 obligatory rak'ahs of Fajr time, because he didn't intend obligation in his intention. Let's say instead that somebody, just, in his heart, he really wanted to worship his creator and he just decided to pray 2 rak'ahs. Like say it was the middle of the night. Okay, these 2 rak'ahs don't have a time, don't have a cause, and they're definitely not obligatory. So what will he intend? He will just intend Salat. His intention will be, I pray. That's it. Because those 2 rak'ahs don't have a time or a cause, so he doesn't need to include that in his intention, and they're not obligatory, so he doesn't need to include that in his intention either. Okay, he's just going to say, in his intention, I pray. The second integral, number 2, for those of you following in your book, number 2 is to say Allahu Akbar. So the first integral is the intention. And we mentioned that the time for the intention is while you're saying Allahu Akbar. Now the second integral is the actual saying of Allahu Akbar. So saying Allahu Akbar is an integral of its own. And the first integral, which is the intention, needs to be present in the heart while you're saying integral number 2, which is Allahu Akbar. Now, just to be clear, the words that we say are Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Actually, brother, can you put my screen back up? Let me see if I can do it. I don't think I can do it myself. Uh-oh. Okay, well, I'll just talk through it then. What we say when we start the Salat is Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Okay, there are a lot of people who don't say this phrase carefully, and they end up saying something which is not valid. For example, there's no W anywhere in the sentence Allahu Akbar. There's no W in it. Okay, so if someone says Allahu Akbar, that's not valid because Wekbar, there is no Wekbar. Okay, we're not saying Allahu Akbar. People who say it fast, that's what they end up saying. They say Allahu Akbar. Okay, that's not valid. So that's not going to be valid if you say Allahu Akbar. You need to say Allahu Akbar. Not wa, Allahu Akbar. Okay? Another mistake, common mistake that people make is they stretch out things that should not be stretched out. So there are lots of A sounds. There are several A sounds in the sentence Allahu Akbar. But the only A sound which is permissible for you to stretch out is the one that comes after the L sound. So it's permissible to say Allahu Akbar. It's also permissible to stretch it out and say Allahu Akbar. All right, that A sound that comes right after the L, that one you can stretch out. Although it's better if you don't stretch it out too long. But that one you can stretch out. All the other A's do not get stretched out. Okay, it is not permissible for a person to say Allahu Akbar. Okay, that first A is not permissible to say that, to stretch that one out. Also, the last A, the one before the R, it's not permissible to stretch it out. Okay, it's not permissible for a person to say Allahu Akbar. Not permissible. Now, I'm not going to tell you now what those things mean, but just know that if a person says Allahu Akbar, it is not at all acceptable in this deen to say that. Or if a person says Allahu Akbar, it is not at all permissible in this deen to say something like that. Okay, you all don't even know what you're saying about Allah if you pronounce it that way, but those are different words. It's not Akbar. If a person says Akbar, it's a completely different word. Yeah, I mean, those I think are the most common mistakes that need to be avoided. In short, you want to say Allahu, and then you want to say Akbar. Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Okay? That's how you want to say it. That is the second integral of Salat. This integral, just like all the integrals of Salat which are spoken, all the verbal integrals of Salat, you need to say it loud enough that you hear yourself. So when a person says Allahu Akbar, he needs to pronounce it loud enough that he hears with his own ear what he said. Okay, this does not mean you have to say it loud. You know, when you're praying in the masjid, usually the imam says it loudly. He says Allahu Akbar. That does not mean that the people praying behind him all have to shout it. Okay, if you're praying behind the imam, there's no need for you to raise your voice. You just need to say it loudly enough that you can hear yourself. Okay, there's no need for the person right next to you to hear it, but you need to hear it. And that's true for every single one of the integrals we're going to mention that are spoken integrals. If it's a spoken integral, you need to hear yourself say it, or else it doesn't count. The third integral. So the first integral was the intention. The second integral was the takbir. And the third integral, it says to stand for the obligatory prayer when able. So the third integral is that you stand up if you're able to stand up. Okay, if a person is not able to stand, then they can pray sitting. But if you're able to stand, then you must stand up in the obligatory salat. If the salat you're praying is not an obligation, then you don't have to stand up. Okay, it's mentioned in the hadith that if a person prays sitting, when they're able to pray standing, then he gets half the reward. And if a person prays lying down, when he's able to pray sitting, he gets half the reward of a sitting person. Okay, so we are permitted to pray sitting down when we're praying some optional salat. But we are not permitted to sit down during an obligatory salat when we have the ability to stand. If we're able to stand up, then that standing position, you know, the position when we say the Fatiha, you must be standing for it if you're able to. That's the third integral, to stand for the obligatory prayer if you're able to. And I'll stop there, insha'Allah, because there's a whole lot to say about integral number 4. Integral number 4 is reciting Surah Al-Fatiha. And there's a lot to say, so we'll start there next week, insha'Allah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. If there are any questions, I'll take them now. This hadith, I'm not aware of a hadith that mentions that specific benefit. That doesn't mean there's no hadith out there like that, but I don't recall ever hearing one like that. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, again, I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate you listening. And I very strongly urge you, please pay close attention to these Salat chapters. Salat is extremely important. We do it every single day. Okay, and many of us perform our salats, 95% correctly. There's like one little mistake that they never thought about or never heard about. And our goal with this book is to correct those sorts of things, the small things that we somehow overlooked when we were learning, so that our acts of worship will be done properly. And, foremost among the acts of worship is the salat. So I appreciate you coming. I appreciate you listening. And I hope you continue to do so. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Let's close with dua. لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Barakallahu feekum. I'll see you next week at the same time, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.